A drunk father mistreated his own daughter, until one day, tired of so many humiliations and abuses, the daughter decided to take merciless revenge and made the worst decision of her life. Valeria was sitting on the floor of her room, surrounded by books and notebooks. The dim light of a table lamp illuminated the mess around her, but her eyes were fixed on a distant point beyond the open pages in front of her. Though she tried to study for her final exams at university, her mind was miles away, trapped in the same endless cycle of fear and uncertainty. Outside her room, the house was in an uncomfortable silence. She knew her mother, Eva, was in the kitchen, busy with her daily routine of preparing dinner, but she also knew that silence wouldn't last long. Her father, Ruben, would be back soon, stumbling as always, with a half-empty bottle in hand and rage ready to erupt. It was the same routine every night, and each time it became harder to endure the tension that filled the air in those moments. A creak at the front door broke the silence, making Valeria lift her head suddenly. The sound paralyzed her for a second, as if she already knew what was coming. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath, mentally preparing for the inevitable. From the kitchen, she heard her mother's muffled voice. "Ruben, did you drink that much again?" Eva asked in a barely audible tone, filled with exhaustion. Ruben didn't answer. Only erratic steps drew closer, and Valeria knew that at any moment, the usual chaos would erupt. She decided not to move, trying to convince herself that maybe this time he'd just go to bed. But that hope lasted only a few seconds. The door to her room burst open, and there was her father, his eyes red and filled with anger, swaying in the doorway. "Valeria," he roared. "What are you doing there, always hiding? Get out here and talk to me." His breath reeked of alcohol, a mix of rage and despair that Valeria knew all too well. Valeria clenched her fists but remained silent. She knew that any word she spoke would only make him angrier. Ruben took a step toward her, stumbling and threw one of the room's chairs against the wall, making the sound echo through the house. The impact made Eva appear at the doorway, her eyes filled with fear. "Leave her alone, Ruben," Eva said in a desperate whisper. "She's studying." Ruben turned to her, his expression twisting into a sneer. "Studying?" he scoffed bitterly. "For what? To be smarter than me? Do you think I care about what she's doing?" Valeria, still silent, felt adrenaline coursing through her body. Every night was a repetition of the same cycle, shouting, violence, tears. But something in her, that night, had changed. She was tired, exhausted from living in fear, from existing in the darkness of that house with no escape. Her eyes met her mother's for a moment. Eva looked at her pleadingly, begging her with her gaze not to do anything. But Valeria could no longer keep silent. "Dad, that's enough," she said, her voice firm, though her body trembled slightly. Ruben stopped abruptly, surprised. It wasn't common for Valeria to speak when he was in that state, let alone with that tone. He turned toward her, approaching as the fury began to bubble again in his eyes. "What did you say?" he asked, challenging her as he took another step toward her. Eva, terrified, tried to intervene between them. "Ruben, please leave her alone." "There's no need," she pleaded, but Ruben pushed her aside roughly, knocking her to the ground. Valeria felt something break inside her as she saw her mother fall. For years, she had endured the humiliation and pain, but seeing Eva treated like that before her eyes ignited a flame she could no longer extinguish. She stood up quickly, facing her father. "I said that's enough," she shouted, unable to hold back anymore. "You have no right to keep treating us like this." Ruben looked at her with a mix of surprise and contained rage. He seemed unable to believe that his daughter, the same one he had controlled with shouts and blows for years, would dare to defy him that way. "You're going to tell me what to do," he growled as he moved closer to her, his body swaying from the alcohol, but his hands ready to unleash another wave of violence. Valeria didn't back down. Something inside her, maybe the accumulation of all those years of fear, pushed her forward. She couldn't let this night be like the others. It had to end. "I'm not afraid of you," she murmured, though her heart pounded fiercely. Reuben raised his hand, like so many times before, but before he could unleash his fury, an unfamiliar voice sounded from the doorway. "That's enough, Reuben." The three of them turned simultaneously. Julian, the family's neighbor, stood at the entrance. He seemed more determined than ever, arms crossed, and a piercing look directed at Reuben. He had heard the shouting and finally decided to intervene. It was the first time anyone outside the family had entered the dynamics of this domestic hell. Reuben stood still for a moment, as if the presence of an outside witness had instantly cut off his fury. Valeria, still trembling, didn't know what to think. She had never expected anyone, least of all Julian, to intervene in their family matters. "What do you think you're doing, Julian?" Reuben spat, trying to reclaim his posture of authority. "This isn't your business." Julian advanced calmly but firmly. His eyes didn't waver from Reuben. "Yes, it is," he said firmly. "I've heard what goes on in this house for far too long. I won't let it continue." Reuben stared at him, and for a moment, Valeria thought she saw a flicker of doubt in her father's eyes. The silence became heavy, almost unbearable, until Reuben, without saying another word, lowered his hand and turned, stumbling toward the front door. Eva was still on the ground, crying quietly, and Valeria couldn't take her eyes off her father as he left, slamming the door behind him. The room was left in a heavy silence. Valeria sank to the floor, feeling exhaustion wash over her. Julian remained in the doorway, watching, unsure if he should approach or not. "Are you okay?" he finally asked, breaking the silence. Valeria looked at him and nodded slowly, though she knew nothing was okay. Nothing had been okay for years. But that night, something had changed. Minutes later, Valeria remained on the floor of her room, feeling her body slowly relax after the storm that had just passed. The echo of the door her father had slammed on his way out still resonated in her mind, but for the first time in a long while, she did not feel the weight of despair pulling her down. The silence in the house was no longer a threat, but a relief, an unexpected truce. Julian, who was still standing in the doorway, observed the scene with a mixture of concern and relief. He knew that what he had done that night was a delicate step, and though Reuben had left, the consequences of his intervention could be unpredictable. "I'm sorry for getting involved," Julian said softly, breaking the silence. Valeria looked up at him, her eyes still shining with held-back tears. She struggled to process everything that had happened. For years, she had wished that someone, anyone, would intervene to stop her father. And now, just when she herself had begun to resist, someone had appeared, right when she needed it the most. "You don't have to apologize," Valeria replied with a faint smile she could barely keep. "Thank you for what you did." Julian nodded, feeling there was nothing more to say. He walked toward the exit, giving her the space she needed, but before leaving, he paused. "If you ever need it, Valeria, I'm here. Don't hesitate to call me," he said, with a serious and sincere look. Valeria nodded, and then Julian disappeared, leaving her alone with the echo of his words. Eva, still on the floor, was trying to calm her sobs. Valeria looked at her for a long moment, feeling a deep pain for her mother. She knew that she, too, had been a victim all that time, although she couldn't understand why she had let things go so far. She stood up and walked slowly to her mother, kneeling beside her. "Mom," she whispered, taking her hand, "we can't keep going like this. This has to end." Eva looked into her eyes, her cheeks wet with tears. There was still a glimmer of fear in her gaze, but also something else, something Valeria hadn't seen in her for years, the spark of hope. "I don't know how, Valeria," Eva said in a faint voice. "I've been trapped in this for so long. I don't know if I can get out." Valeria hugged her, holding her with a strength she had never shown before. She knew her mother's emotional wounds were deep, that fear had consumed her for years. But this time, Valeria was determined not to let that cycle continue. "You don't have to do it alone, Mom. We're getting out of here." Together, she whispered, convinced that this time, escape was indeed possible. That night, for the first time in years, the house remained silent, and mother and daughter slept curled up on the small sofa in the living room. The threat that had always lurked in the darkness felt distant, as if they had finally crossed a threshold that had seemed unreachable for so long. The next day, as the sun barely peeked over the horizon, Valeria made a decision. She rose early, before her mother woke up, and walked to the local police station. She had feared for years what reporting her father would mean, but now she felt it was the only path to freedom. The officer who attended to her listened carefully, taking note of every detail as Valeria, with a trembling but resolute voice, recounted the years of abuse and terror she and her mother had endured. "We will do what's necessary to protect you," said the officer at the end of her statement. "Your father won't be able to hurt you again." The officer's words echoed in her mind as she walked home. It wasn't an empty promise. This time, things would change. When she arrived, she found Eva sitting at the kitchen table, holding a cup of coffee. Her mother looked at her with questioning eyes, but didn't ask anything. She knew that something in Valeria had changed, something she herself hadn't had the courage to face in years. "I did it, Mom," Valeria said, sitting across from her. "I reported him. Dad won't hurt us again." Eva looked at her in silence for a long moment, and then, without warning, began to cry. But this time, the tears were not of fear or sadness, but of relief. A relief she had waited for so long that she could barely recognize it. "I'm so proud of you," Eva whispered through sobs. "I don't know how I let all of this happen." Valeria took her hands, squeezing them gently. "It's not your fault, Mom. Neither of us was to blame. But it doesn't matter anymore what happened. What matters is that now we have a chance to start over." The days that followed were complicated. Ruben was arrested and faced charges of domestic abuse. Although he denied everything, the evidence and testimonies of Valeria and Eva were enough for justice to take action. It was an emotionally exhausting battle, but in the end, mother and daughter achieved what had seemed impossible for years: freedom from their abuser. The house that had once been a place of terror began to transform. Valeria decided to continue her studies, supported by her mother, who slowly began to regain her strength. Both knew that the road to healing would be long, but for the first time in a long time, they could walk it together without fear. One afternoon, as Valeria was studying in her room, her mother entered with a small box in her hands. "I found this while cleaning your father's room," Eva said, with a strange tone in her voice. Valeria looked at her, puzzled, as she opened the box. Inside, she found old photos of her father, long before alcohol and violence had taken over. There were pictures from his youth, smiling, with a family that Valeria had never known. "Your father wasn't always like this," Eva said, sitting beside her. "In the beginning, he was different. But bad decisions, debts, alcohol, they changed him. I'm not excusing what he did, but I want you to know that, at one point, there was something good in him." Valeria looked at the photos, feeling a mixture of emotions. She had spent so much time hating him that it was hard to imagine he had ever been someone else. But at the same time, those photos reminded her of a larger truth. The cycle of abuse was not just a matter of pure evil, but of poorly made choices, of wounds left unhealed. "It doesn't matter who he was, Mom," Valeria finally said, closing the box. "What matters is who we are now and what we'll do from here on." Eva looked at her with a proud smile, and Valeria felt that, for the first time in her life, she was truly in control of her own destiny. The grand finale wasn't a victory over absolute evil, but a triumph over fear, over the ghosts of the past that had tried to destroy them. Mother and daughter, now free, knew that the future would be complicated, but they also knew that together, they could face it with their heads held high. And in that moment, as the sunset bathed the house in its warm light, they both felt something they hadn't felt in years: hope. Valeria watched from the living room window as the last rays of sunlight illuminated the street. It had been several days since Ruben's arrest, and the atmosphere in the house had changed in a way that Valeria could hardly describe. What was once constant tension, an undercurrent of fear, had now transformed into an eerie calm, as if the house itself were learning to breathe again, to be a home. Her mother, Eva, was in the kitchen, moving with a lightness Valeria couldn't remember ever seeing in her. Life was starting to return to their bodies, although the emotional wounds were still deep. They knew healing wouldn't be a quick or easy process, but they were together, and that was what mattered most. Suddenly, the doorbell rang, pulling her from her thoughts. Valeria frowned. She wasn't expecting anyone. Opening the door, she found Julian, their neighbor. He stood on the threshold, a small smile on his lips, but his eyes reflected a mix of concern and relief. "Hi, Julian," Valeria said, surprised but grateful for his visit. "I didn't expect to see you." Julian shrugged, showing a characteristic humility. "I wanted to see how you were doing," he replied, his voice soft. "After everything that happened, I thought you might need a little support." Valeria stepped aside to let him in. It was strange how someone who had been just a background figure in her life had, in a matter of days, become an unexpected ally. Yet she couldn't deny that his presence gave her a sense of security. "I think we're okay," Valeria said as she guided him to the living room. "It's still hard, but at least we can breathe now." "That's already a lot." Julian nodded, looking around the room with curiosity. It was evident he could feel the change in the house's atmosphere. "It must be an enormous relief," he commented as he sat down on the sofa, his hands clasped in front of him. "I've seen what a toxic home can do to people, and what you and your mother have done is admirable. Not everyone has the courage to take that step." Valeria looked at him with a grateful expression. She knew he was right. The courage they had needed to break the cycle of abuse was something only those who experienced it could understand. "It wasn't easy," Valeria confessed, her voice dropping slightly. "There were so many times I thought I couldn't do it, that it would be easier just to endure. But it wasn't just for me anymore. I couldn't let my mother keep living like that." Julian watched her in silence, his gaze understanding, and after a moment, he nodded slowly. "You did the right thing," he said gently. "No matter what comes next, you've already won the hardest battle." Eva appeared from the kitchen, drying her hands with a cloth, and smiled when she saw Julian. "Julian, it's so nice to see you," she said in a voice that, although it still held traces of exhaustion, sounded firmer than before. "We owe you a lot." "You don't owe me anything," he replied, shaking his head. "I just did what anyone should do. No one deserves to live in fear." Eva nodded, although her eyes revealed that she still carried some guilt for allowing the abuse to continue for so long. Valeria noticed and couldn't help but feel a pang of sadness for her mother. She knew that even though Ruben was no longer there, the shadow of what they had lived through would stay with them for a while. "Would you like to stay for dinner?" Eva asked, changing the subject with a kind smile. "I'm making something simple, but we'd love to have you." Julian, surprised, looked at Valeria before accepting with a smile. "I'd love to, thank you." Dinner was peaceful, an almost surreal experience for Valeria and Eva. It was the first time in years that they shared a meal without the constant tension of Ruben's return. There were soft laughs, simple conversations about the future, about what Valeria wanted to do after finishing her studies. It was as if, slowly, normal life was finding its way back. After dinner, while they cleared the plates, Julian offered to help, but Valeria stopped him with a gesture. "You've done enough," she said with a sincere smile. "We need to learn to do this ourselves again." Julian nodded, respecting her request, but before leaving, he approached Valeria while her mother was in the kitchen. "Valeria, there's something else I want to tell you," he murmured, his tone more serious. Valeria looked at him curiously. "What is it?" Julian seemed to hesitate for a moment, as if he were carefully choosing his words. "Your father, Ruben, has more problems than you realize. When I confronted him that night, it wasn't just because of what he was doing at home. I've heard things about him in the community. Debts, dangerous people who might try to come around. I don't want to alarm you, but I want you to be prepared." Valeria's heart skipped a beat. She knew Ruben had a dark side, but she had never thought about the consequences beyond their own family. "Do you think someone might come looking for us?" she asked, her voice trembling with sudden fear. Julian looked at her seriously. "It's possible. If you ever feel like something isn't right, call the police. And don't hesitate to call me too. I'll be around, but I don't want you to live in fear again." Valeria nodded, her mind processing the new threat that had just entered her life. Just when she thought the danger was gone, something else appeared on the horizon, an unknown but equally unsettling shadow. That night, after Julian left, Valeria sat next to her mother on the sofa, not saying a word about the warning he had given her. She knew Eva had suffered enough, and for now, she wanted to give her a bit of peace. "Mom, I want us to move forward," she finally said, breaking the silence. "I want us to leave this house. Start fresh somewhere else. Leave all this behind." Eva looked at her, surprised, but her eyes softened as she understood the depth of her daughter's desire. "You're right, Valeria. It's time to leave it all behind. We deserve a new life." And so, with the promise of a new beginning in the air, mother and daughter began planning a future far from the shadows of the past. They knew the road would be long and filled with uncertainty, but for the first time in a long time, they were ready to face it together, with the hope that true freedom was finally within their reach. Weeks later, Valeria stood in the middle of the living room, looking at the few belongings still left in the house. Open boxes and half-packed suitcases filled the space, but there was something more than the physical clutter occupying the room. There was a feeling of closure, a transition that had taken far too long to arrive, but now felt inevitable. She and her mother were ready to move, to leave behind the place that had witnessed so much pain. Eva appeared from the kitchen, holding a cardboard box in her hands, a look of exhaustion on her face. "This is everything," she said quietly, setting the box on the floor. "I can't believe we're doing this." Valeria watched her in silence. She knew that, for her mother, this step meant more than just moving somewhere else. It was a farewell to a life of submission, a final break from the past that had tormented them. But it was also a testament to their resilience. "It's for the best, Mom," Valeria said gently. "This place has hurt us too much. We deserve something better." Eva nodded but couldn't help glancing at the walls, as if she still doubted they were making the right decision. Living in chaos and fear for so many years had left scars, and though they knew leaving was necessary, the memories remained, clinging to every corner of the house. Suddenly, a knock on the door interrupted the moment. Valeria frowned. They weren't expecting anyone, and Julian had promised to come by later to help with the move. She approached the door cautiously, and when she opened it, the cold air from outside hit her. On the other side stood a tall man with a stern look, dressed in a long coat that seemed out of place in the warm neighborhood atmosphere. His expression was inscrutable, but his eyes fixed on Valeria with an intensity that made her step back slightly. "Are you Valeria Gomez?" the man asked, his tone dry and direct. Valeria tensed, trying to stay calm. "Yes, that's me," she replied, not taking her eyes off the stranger. "Can I help you with something?" The man took his time before speaking, as if he was weighing each word. "I'm looking for Ruben Gomez," he finally said. "I understand this was his home." Valeria felt a chill run down her spine. She knew this had to do with Julian's warning. The ghosts of her father's past wouldn't fade so easily. Her first instinct was to protect her mother, but she also knew that lying or trying to hide the truth would only make things worse. "My father doesn't live here anymore," she said firmly. "He was arrested a few weeks ago. If you're looking for him, I suggest you talk to the police." The man tilted his head, as if evaluating Valeria's response. For a few seconds, the silence between them became unbearable. Finally, he nodded, but his expression didn't change. "I will," he replied in a tone that conveyed neither acceptance nor threat. "I just wanted to make sure his family wasn't in the way." Before Valeria could respond, the man turned and disappeared down the street, walking with slow but determined steps. Valeria slammed the door shut and leaned against it, trying to process what had just happened. Her breathing was rapid, and her mind raced, searching for meaning in the brief exchange. Eva looked at her with concern from the other side of the room. "Who was that?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Valeria, still shaking, tried to reassure her mother. "Someone looking for Dad," she whispered. "But it doesn't matter anymore. He's not coming back, and we're far from it now." Eva slowly approached her daughter, placing a hand on her shoulder, as if that simple gesture could bring her calm. They both knew that, even though Ruben was no longer in their lives, the consequences of his actions would still haunt them for a while. But what mattered was that they were together, stronger than ever. "We're leaving tomorrow," Eva said, with more determination in her voice. "No matter what happens, we're leaving, Valeria." The next day, with the first rays of sun, Valeria and Eva finished packing their remaining belongings. Julian arrived with his truck, ready to help with the move. There was an air of optimism in his movements, as if the promise of a new beginning was within reach. As they loaded boxes and suitcases, Valeria couldn't help but recall all the times she had dreamed of this day of freedom. However, before leaving, Valeria took a moment to say goodbye to the house. Despite all the pain it had caused them, it had been their home. She walked through each room, remembering the good times, the fleeting laughter that had existed before the shadows consumed everything. She knew she was leaving behind more than walls and memories. She was leaving a version of herself that no longer existed, a person broken by fear. Eva appeared at the front door, waiting for Valeria with a small, sad smile. "It's time," she said, her voice firm but filled with emotion. Valeria took a deep breath and nodded, leaving the house for the last time. The sky was blue, clear, and the sun shone with an intensity Valeria hadn't felt in a long time. It was as if the world was welcoming them into their new life. Julian was waiting by the truck, hands on the wheel. "Ready for the big trip?" he asked, his jovial tone trying to lighten the emotion of the moment. Valeria nodded, climbing into the passenger seat, while Eva settled into the back. "Yes," Valeria replied, looking at the road ahead. "We're ready." As the truck started and they left the neighborhood behind, Valeria couldn't help but smile. For the first time in a long while, she felt in control of her life, that the scars of the past wouldn't define her. She knew the future would bring new challenges, but she was ready to face them. And as the horizon stretched before them, mother and daughter, finally free, knew they had left the pain behind forever. The landscape flew by as Julian's truck sped along the highway. Valeria watched the fields on either side, feeling a mix of excitement and nerves. She knew leaving the past behind was for the best, but she also knew it wouldn't be easy. Starting anew in a different place meant adapting, rebuilding, and, above all, healing. And though the freedom she felt now was a relief, the fear of the unknown still lingered in a corner of her mind. "Are you okay?" Julian asked from the driver's seat, noticing Valeria's prolonged silence. She looked at him and forced a smile. "Yes, I was just thinking about everything we left behind," she replied, eyes fixed on the horizon. "It feels unreal, like something so big couldn't be this easy to leave." Julian nodded, knowing Valeria's words carried a weight he couldn't fully imagine. "It's normal to feel that way," he said softly. "But remember, not everything we leave behind is bad. What you went through made you strong, and that strength will carry you far in what's to come. It won't be easy, but you've already gone through the worst. Valeria looked at him in silence for a moment. She knew he was right, but that strength he spoke of felt fragile. She had fought so hard to protect her mother and herself that she still didn't know how to live without being constantly on alert. "I hope you're right," Valeria said, sighing. "Sometimes it feels like the fear is still there, lurking, waiting for the right moment to take over again." Julian looked at her with an understanding expression. He knew that emotional wounds take much longer to heal than physical ones. "And if that moment comes, you won't be alone," he said firmly. "You have your mother and you have me. No one's going to let you fall this time." As they drove on, the landscape began to change. Houses grew further apart, and the tall buildings of the city were left behind. Valeria didn't know exactly where this new chapter would lead her, but there was a promise of peace that kept her hopeful. Eva, in the back seat, remained silent, but her mind was constantly processing what was happening. She had spent so much time trapped in fear that imagining a different life seemed almost impossible. But looking at her daughter, she saw something she hadn't recognized in a long time: determination. Valeria had become someone strong, someone capable of facing whatever came, and that gave Eva a small spark of hope. "I'm proud of you," she said suddenly, breaking the silence. "I don't know if I ever told you, but you're the best thing I have in this life, Valeria." Valeria felt a lump in her throat. Something about those words touched a deep chord. She turned slightly to look at her mother. "Thank you, Mom," she said with a shaky voice. "I didn't do this alone. I needed you as much as you needed me." The rest of the drive passed in silence, but a comfortable, reflective silence. When they arrived at their new home, a small house on the outskirts, Valeria and Eva were surprised by the tranquility that surrounded the place. It wasn't luxurious, but there was something comforting in its simplicity. "We can start fresh here," Valeria said, stepping out of the truck and looking at the facade with a mix of relief and anticipation. "This is all we need." Julian helped them unload the boxes and bags. Although they didn't bring much with them, the process of emptying the truck felt symbolic, as if they were unloading the weight of their past with each item they took out. "Well, it looks like you're all set," Julian said, resting his hands on his hips as he looked around. "If you need anything else, you know where to find me. You're not alone in this." Valeria looked at him gratefully, knowing that without him, this moment might not have been possible. They said their goodbyes, and when Julian finally left, mother and daughter were alone in front of their new home. A gentle breeze blew, and Valeria took it as a sign that things would start to improve. They entered together, and that first night in their new home was different. They slept without sudden awakenings, without the constant threat that something terrible might happen at any moment. For the first time in a long time, they could relax. The weight they had carried for years was starting to dissipate, although they knew that true healing was only beginning. The days passed quickly in their new home. Eva and Valeria adapted to the routine with surprising ease, though shadows of the past still hovered around them, especially in the quiet moments when memories surfaced in the silence of the house. Valeria enrolled in a local course to continue her studies, while Eva began exploring the possibility of working in something new, something that would allow her to regain some of the independence she had lost over the years. But despite all the progress they were making, something in Valeria still felt out of place. A constant unease tormented her. It was as if, no matter how far they were from their old home, the past was still trying to catch up with them. And then, one day, that feeling became real. Valeria was returning from a walk when she noticed a familiar figure in the distance. It was the same man who had come looking for her father weeks ago. He was leaning against a post, watching the house from afar, as if waiting for Valeria to notice him. Fear gripped her in an instant, but this time, she wasn't willing to run. She was no longer the terrified girl who had endured so much. She decided to confront him. "What are you doing here?" she asked, approaching him with firm steps, though her heart was pounding in her chest. The man didn't seem surprised by her confrontation. He gave her a sideways smile, as if he had been waiting for this moment. "I'm just checking that you're okay," he said in a tone that suggested he wasn't talking about physical well-being. "After all, your father had some outstanding debts." Valeria felt her blood run cold, but she showed no weakness. She knew these men wouldn't give up easily. "My father is no longer my problem," she replied firmly. "If you have something to settle with him, find him yourself. We have nothing to do with his issues." The man looked at her intently, as if trying to read her soul, but after a few seconds, he shrugged. "I'll keep that in mind," he said before turning and walking away slowly. Valeria watched him leave, her body still tense with fear and adrenaline. She knew this wouldn't be the last time she saw him, but something inside her told her she was ready. She was prepared to defend her mother, to defend herself, and to fight for the new life they were building. That night, she told Eva everything. Together, they decided that even though threats from the past could return, they wouldn't allow them to steal what they had worked so hard to gain. They knew the road wouldn't be easy, but they would no longer be intimidated. Valeria realized that her true strength didn't lie just in escaping what had been, but in facing what could come. Because, even though fear persisted, it would no longer control their lives. And together, mother and daughter decided they would live without fear, with hope shining on the horizon. Days later, the morning light filtered softly through the curtains of Valeria and Eva's new home. The fresh air brought a sense of renewal, yet the memory of the stranger's visit still weighed heavily on Valeria's mind. Over the past few days, she had tried to go on with her life, focusing on her studies and helping her mother adjust to their new routine, but the persistent threat of her father's unfinished business kept her on alert. One afternoon, as Valeria was returning from the community center where she took her classes, she received a message from Julian. "We need to talk. It's urgent. Let's meet at the cafe next to your house." Valeria felt a twinge of unease. Julian rarely sent her messages like that, and if he considered something urgent, it was likely related to the shadow Ruben had cast over them. She headed straight to the cafe, her heart pounding. When she arrived, she found Julian seated at a table in the back, his face serious, wearing an expression she hadn't seen before. She sat across from him, waiting for him to speak first. "Valeria, I've been looking into the guy who showed up at your house," he began, his tone low and somber. "There's something darker behind all of this than we thought." Valeria felt a knot form in her stomach. "What have you found out?" Julian took a deep breath, as though the weight of what he was about to say was difficult to bear. "Your father didn't just owe money. He was involved with dangerous people, but not for money, something more personal. Rumor has it that before all this started, Ruben betrayed someone important within that crime network. Now, it seems that person has their eyes on you and your mother as a way to get revenge." The silence between them was overwhelming. Valeria felt the ground crumble beneath her. Despite having left her father behind, the ghosts of his mistakes still haunted them. "So, we're in danger?" she asked, trying to process the gravity of the situation. "I'm not sure," Julian replied, gripping his hands on the table. "But if that man showed up at your house, I don't think it's just a warning. We need to stay alert." Valeria took a deep breath, trying to stay calm, but her concern for her mother flooded her immediately. "Should I tell my mom?" she asked quietly. "I don't want her to live in fear again." Julian looked at her, his eyes filled with understanding. "She has the right to know, but I understand you want to protect her. If you decide not to tell her yet, we should come up with a plan to stay prepared. We can't let them control you both again." Valeria nodded, feeling a wave of determination replace her fear. She couldn't afford to be the victim anymore. This time, she would do whatever it took to protect her mother and keep the shadows at bay. That night, Valeria decided not to tell Eva what Julian had discovered. Not yet. She knew her mother was starting to feel calm for the first time in years, and she didn't want to shatter that peace. But as she sat in her room, watching the stars through the window, she couldn't shake the feeling that something dark was approaching. Days went by, and although the tension still weighed on Valeria, the routine of her new life kept her busy. However, the calm wouldn't last. One afternoon, while Valeria was at the library at the community center, her phone vibrated insistently. It was Julian again. "Valeria, I need you to come home now. Something's happening." Panic seized her immediately. Without thinking, she grabbed her bag and rushed out of the building, her heart racing as she called for a taxi. When she arrived on her street, she saw Julian's truck parked outside her house. It wasn't the only one. There were 2 other cars, unfamiliar, parked at the entrance, and from her house's window, Valeria could see her mother, Eva, standing in the living room with a tall, burly man in front of her. Valeria felt her blood turn to ice. She ran to the door and entered the house. "Mom," she shouted as she crossed the threshold, her voice filled with desperation. Eva turned to her, her eyes full of terror. "Valeria, everything's fine," Eva said quickly, trying to calm her. "This man wants to talk." The man Valeria had seen days earlier was there, his face impassive, but with an intimidating presence that made the air in the room feel dense. "So we finally meet again," the man said in a low, cold voice. "Your father left us in chaos, and now someone has to pay for it." Valeria took a step forward, her fear turning into anger. "We have nothing to do with him. We left that life behind. We don't owe anyone anything." The man raised an eyebrow as if assessing the situation. He took a couple of steps toward Valeria, his dominating figure overshadowing the small room. "It's not just about money. It's about loyalty, about betrayals that need correction. Your father can't pay, but you." He paused, looking at Valeria with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You're his legacy." Eva, who had been paralyzed by fear until now, stepped forward toward the man, her face showing a resolve Valeria hadn't seen in years. "We are not part of that life. I am not his legacy, and neither is my daughter. If you're looking for revenge, you've got the wrong people." The man looked at her, amused by her sudden bravery, but something in his expression changed. He seemed to reassess them, as if considering his options. "You're strong, I'll give you that. Perhaps you're not responsible for Ruben's mistakes, but that doesn't change the reality." However, he paused, observing the fear and courage mixed in Valeria's and Eva's eyes. "I can offer a deal." Valeria wasn't sure if she could trust what he was about to say. "What kind of deal?" she asked cautiously. The man smiled slowly. "You disappear. Forget this life and I forget you. Ruben is finished, but there's no point in me wasting my resources on people who aren't worth it. Get out of my way, and you'll never hear from me or anyone else again." Relief mixed with skepticism flooded Valeria. Disappear. Start over, far away from everything. It was what they had always wanted, but now the price seemed high. "How can we trust that you won't come after us again?" she asked, her voice trembling with uncertainty. "I'm not a man to waste time, girl," the man replied. "If you disappear, I handle my own business. If you stay and interfere, well, you know what happens to people who get in the way." Eva squeezed Valeria's hand, her gaze pleading for a way out, an answer. Valeria, seeing the desperation in her mother's eyes and feeling the threat still looming, nodded. "All right, we'll go." The man gave them one last smile, as if it were all just a game to him. "Good choice," he said before turning and leaving behind a silence that felt suffocating. When the door closed behind him, Eva collapsed onto the sofa, her breathing labored and tears welling in her eyes. "Do you think we can really escape?" she asked, her voice broken with anguish. Valeria knelt beside her, holding her hand firmly. "We will, Mom. This time, we will do it right." They knew that the decision they had made would take them to another chapter of their lives, one filled with uncertainty. But they also knew that, together, they were stronger than any man or past could imagine. The air in the small house was thick with the tension of what had just happened. Valeria and Eva remained silent, their breaths shallow as they processed the agreement they had made with the man who had been threatening their lives. The words still echoed in Valeria's mind, "Disappear, and I won't look for you." Eva, still trembling, rose from the couch and walked to the window, looking outside as if expecting something else to happen. Valeria watched her in silence, knowing that the decision they had just made would change their lives forever. She knew they would have to leave everything behind once again, but this time it wasn't just to escape fear. It was to find true freedom. "I can't believe this is happening again," Eva said in a faint voice. "I thought we'd left it all behind. But the past always seems to find us." Valeria stood and walked toward her mother, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Mom, this is our chance. They gave us a way out. We can leave, start fresh somewhere else, this time for real. No more threats, no more fear. We just have to be brave one more time." Eva turned to Valeria, her eyes filled with tears. For years, she had been the fragile woman who relied on her daughter for protection, but now, something in her eyes seemed to have changed. It was as if, for the first time, she was willing to fight for that new life, rather than just run away. "You're right," Eva said with a sigh. "We can't keep running from fear. If this is our last chance at peace, we need to take it. But this time, I want to do it right. I don't want our lives to be marked only by fear and running." Valeria nodded, relieved by the determination in her mother's words. They both knew what this meant, leaving behind everything they had tried to build once again, but this time with a plan. Valeria sat across from Eva, and together they began to plan their next move. "We can't just disappear," Valeria said thoughtfully. "We have to make sure we can't be tracked. Whether it means moving to another country or even changing our names. Leave no trace. Do you agree?" Eva looked at her intently, more serious than Valeria had seen her in years. "Yes, Valeria, I agree. Let's do it right this time." The following weeks were a whirlwind of preparation. Julian, who was aware of everything, offered his help to ensure Valeria and Eva could disappear completely. He found contacts in another city, trusted people who could help them start fresh with new identities. Though leaving Julian behind was a difficult decision for Valeria, she knew it was the right thing to do. One night, just before leaving, Valeria and Eva sat in the small living room for the last time. Their suitcases were ready, and the train tickets waited on the table. "I never thought the day would come when I'd have to start over so far away," Eva murmured, looking at the photos still hanging on the wall. Pictures of Valeria as a child, of Ruben before alcohol destroyed him. "But it's what's best for us. I know that." Valeria leaned toward her mother, taking her hand. "This time will be different, Mom. We'll have a normal life. No fear, no running. Just us." Eva nodded, squeezing her daughter's hand. The two embraced, knowing that the darkest chapter of their lives was about to close. The day of the journey arrived quickly. Valeria and Eva boarded the train, leaving behind everything they knew. As the train pulled away from the station, Valeria watched the landscape change, feeling a mix of sadness and relief. She knew she would never see that place again, but she also knew she would never be trapped by her past. The train ride was long, but calming. For the first time in a long time, mother and daughter could talk about the future without fear. They planned their new lives. Eva dreamed of opening a small cafe, something modest but welcoming, while Valeria thought about finishing her studies and perhaps helping others who had also been through difficult times. When they arrived at their new destination, a small town on the other side of the country, Valeria felt something she hadn't felt in years: hope. The sun was high in the sky, and the fresh air seemed to erase the last vestiges of fear that had weighed on their hearts for so long. They were met by a woman named Sophia, a friend of Julian's who would help them settle in. Sophia took them to a small house on the outskirts, where they could live quietly while they adjusted to their new life. It was a simple house, but for Valeria and Eva, it was a palace. "This place is perfect," Eva said, tears in her eyes as she looked around the house. "I can't believe that after everything we're here." A few days after settling into their new home, Valeria and Eva received unexpected and painful news. One afternoon, while resting in the small garden of their house, a neighbor, who knew their story and had heard certain rumors, approached cautiously and told them what was being said in town. He spoke of Ruben, Valeria's father and Eva's husband. Ruben had died in prison. It wasn't a natural death or an accident. He had been killed by the mafias he had been involved with. According to the rumors, the greatest punishment for Ruben was to never see them again, to live with the weight of losing them and knowing he was forever excluded from their lives. That was the revenge, to see him immersed in deep sadness, regretful and desolate. Death came to him when he was already completely broken by guilt and longing, without any hope of redemption. Valeria felt a lump in her throat. A mix of emotions surged through her. Growing up under the shadow of her father's mistakes had not been easy, but deep down, the thought of his regret, his sadness for having lost them, stirred a strange feeling in her, almost compassionate. She couldn't deny the pain or the harm his decisions had caused them, but something inside her was relieved to know that, in the end, he had understood the weight of his mistakes and deeply regretted his actions. Eva, in silence, let a tear fall. Perhaps a part of her had hoped that Ruben would somehow find peace and change. However, life had made him pay dearly for his choices, and he had gone alone, leaving behind an echo of regret. That night, as Valeria and Eva dined in their new home, the news weighed in the air, but it also reminded them that, although the past had been dark, they had managed to move forward. They looked into each other's eyes, recognizing silently that their bond and strength had been their salvation. From that moment on, they decided to leave behind the last remnants of that life, not with resentment, but with the certainty that they had done the right thing. Thus, as Valeria walked through the local market days later, feeling freedom in every step, she knew that the pain of her losses and the echo of that difficult past only strengthened her determination to build a future full of hope, love, and finally, peace. What did you think of this story? Let us know in the comments, what would you do in a similar situation? We invite you to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with your friends or family as a show of support. This encourages us to keep uploading exciting stories almost every day. Don't miss the next surprising narrative that's about to appear on your screen. We greatly appreciate having you here with us. You can click on the links appearing on your screen now. We have an exclusive selection of captivating stories and guaranteed entertainment just for you. See you in the next video. Big hugs.